Well, good evening and welcome to XTV. We've promised we're going to keep doing this until Auckland is out of alert level 4. We're standing with you, Aucklanders. We hope that you're okay, locked down in your homes, and that people who are feeling all sorts of stresses on their business, on their education, on their health, and just generally wanting to get out, our thoughts are with you. We understand the pressures that this lockdown is creating, and we hope that you're okay. We've been advocating today for a lot more testing. The government has said it will go to level 3 based on politics rather than any kind of new information in our view. We believe that the government should be using rapid antigen testing, rolling out a greater amount of saliva testing, and really getting a clear picture of whether these mystery cases are the tip of an iceberg or actually simply a few freak cases that we shouldn't worry about and could be going down levels. No good to be flying blind. Here's what they could do. If there's a suburb where they're worried, they could use the Mr. Whippy business model and actually have saliva testing or even rapid antigen testing, driving around the streets and inviting people to come out of their homes and be tested. They could also be mailing rapid antigen tests that are commonly used in the UK, in fact, promoted by the National Health Service over there to infected or suspected suburbs where they think there might be infection, and having people test themselves, validate that there isn't any transmission so that we can go back down levels faster. The cost of not doing that is $1 billion a week, but it's also all of those other personal costs that people are increasingly feeling with their frustration under COVID. Tonight, we've got a very special guest, someone I'm really thrilled to have on. I'm thrilled that he's agreed to come on ActTV because he's addressing something that I believe New Zealand needs to talk about. And that is something that has come up through our Honest Conversations tour, our free speech tour, our thank you tour, our election campaign tour. As you know, whenever there's no lockdown, ACT is out touring and listening to people up and down New Zealand. And what I've heard at just about every one of over 100 public meetings I've held in the last year or so is people question, what is going on with the media? Can we trust it? Are they somehow having their strings pulled in the background? Now, I believe for the most part that that's not true. I work with journalists every day. I understand what motivates them. I understand what sort of commercial pressures they're under, and I understand the job that they're trying to do. But I don't think hearing that from me is going to convince a lot of people. So I've asked on Mark Jennings. Mark is someone who's been a journalist for almost 40 years. He's done 10 years in Australia. For 22 years, he was the news director at 3 News. You got to remember, before about 1989, New Zealand had one newsroom run by the state. The introduction of 3 News, a separate and independent news channel, was a massive watershed in New Zealand history. Love it or loathe it, it transformed New Zealand from being a bit of an oddity, sort of the North Korea of the democratic world, to a place that at least had 2 competing views at 6 o'clock when it came to your televised news. And Mark was a central figure as news director for the first 22 years in establishing that. Subsequent to being the news director at 3, he went on to found Newsroom, one of the new, I guess, online alternative forms of news. And they've broken a lot of hard-hitting stories, most recently around some of the uplifts and reverse uplifts taking place at Oranga Tamariki. So I wanted to get Mark on because he's someone I respect, someone that I've worked with and who's covered stories about me and ACT. And I think he's someone who is committed to his craft as a journalist. And I think it's really important for democracy to succeed that we actually understand the institutions we have and hopefully can have some trust in them. So I invited Mark on to have this discussion because so many people have asked me how media works and can they trust it in New Zealand. I think Mark is a great person to address some of the questions and concerns that people have. So thank you very much, Mark, for coming on. We're really grateful for you giving your time. I know there's going to be huge interest because, as I say, so many people have asked me over the years, what's going on with media. And so I wanted to start just by asking you to talk a little bit about where you've come from. I've given a sort of brief synopsis, but tell us a bit about your career as a journalist, what you were aiming to achieve when you set out, and maybe some of the things that you may have learned. And I hope I'm not going to embarrass you, but say a nearly 40-year career.
No, it's not embarrassing, and it's interesting to be sitting on this side of the camera, David. Usually it's me asking the questions and you giving the answers. Yeah, look, I've been a journalist obviously for a long time, and you know, when I look back, probably the toughest assignments have actually always involved politicians, right back to the days of Robert Muldoon. I remember interviewing him on the tarmac at Wellington Airport, Rongotai as it was called back then. There were two, you talked about two TV stations back then. There was TV1 and TV2, and I was working for TV1 and a reporter from TV2, and we both turned up to interview Muldoon out on the tarmac. It was a Fokker friendship that he had just got off. I can't remember what it was about, but the first thing he said to me was, "Why is the two of you here?" And I said to him, "Well, I'm Mark Jennings from TV1, and this is Brent Dumpleton from TV2. You know, we both work for different news services, and we both got questions to ask from you." And he said, "Two news services, eh? Well, not for much longer, Sonny." And it was a, you know, it really struck me as a moment. And it was when I decided to head for Australia. And as soon as I did, Muldoon emerged TV1 and TV2 into one news service.
I don't know what's more worrying, that you were interviewing Muldoon, or that you were there with a Fokker friendship. Weren't they used in World War II?
Yeah, but of course in Australia, I ran into some really tough politicians there. You know, Bob Hawke, Paul Keating. These were guys who were really on their game, and if they sensed any weakness in you at all, they just went for the jugular. And you know, New Zealand politicians are pretty affable beside those guys, that's for sure.
It's interesting you say they went for the jugular, though, because I mean, you know, one thing that journalists do have is they have quite a lot of power, because ultimately they're editing the story, they're deciding which bits to show. So when you say they went for the jugular, this might be a handy tip for me. What did they do that was so effective?
Well, Bob Hawke, I remember, for instance, asking him an economics question, and he said to me, "Are you an economist?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, you don't know anything about economics. Stick to questions you do know something about." So they just looked to try to upend you on your knowledge base. You know, the question I asked him was perfectly legitimate. He just didn't want to answer it, so he just got straight back into me. Paul Keating did it with very sophisticated humour. Probably a little bit in the way of Michael Cullen, the late Michael Cullen, perhaps. He just had that cutting ability to bring you down. Yeah, so they each had their own techniques, but they were used to, of course, dealing with big packs of aggressive journalists. And we hadn't really kind of seen that in New Zealand when I left here and went to Australia. But when I came back, of course, all that, because of TV3, was ramping up. And I understood that a lot. And I tried to bring a bit more differentiation into our own political reporting at 3. And whether you think this is a good thing or not, but I encouraged the likes of Duncan Garner, Paddy Gower, etc., to try to be a bit more, you know, a bit more analytical, a bit more looking for the why in stories. Yes, so I think political reporting particularly has evolved in this country a lot. And it's a lot now more about this idea of holding power to account. The media is almost besotted with it in a way. Everything is about holding people to account now, but it's certainly really evolved that way over the last 40 years.
Yeah. So just thinking about, you know, you've spanned, you know, Australia in the New Zealand in the late 70s, Australia in the 80s, New Zealand in the 80s, 90s, and the last decade outside of TV with Newsroom. Do you think that there is a golden age? Was it a long time ago, maybe in the 60s? Is it through that era of change in the 90s, or is it now with a lot more internet-based platforms? I mean, is there a time that's been better than other periods, or maybe it's now?
Well, look, I definitely think the 80s was an absolutely golden era for television, because they talked about the rivers of gold, really. It was making a lot of money, and it allowed really well-resourced newsrooms and reporters, top quality reporters, time to work on stories. I'm thinking here particularly of Australia when I was there. The last decade has been characterized by really the gutting of the media. Gutting to the extent where when Tim Murphy and I left and set up Newsroom, there were lots of gaps to fill. We felt we had subject areas that we were easily able to exploit because other big media organizations had just abandoned them. But one of the things that I've really noticed over this period, particularly in the last 4 to 5 years, has been this incredible polarization of politics. And I think this has led to some of the mistrust elements, because if you look at the way people perceive you, for instance, you're leader of ACT, but to your voters and followers, you're a hero. And Jacinda Ardern is the same for Labour voters and supporters. She's a hero. She's not really seen as the leader of a political party. She's seen really as a hero, and you're seen as a hero. So when we get stuck into you or the Prime Minister, we're seen to be attacking a hero, and the reaction is really strident from your support bases, and the media is really questioned. But those support bases are not really looking at it through what I would call, a normal lens. And this is the way politics has gone, and it's, I think, pushed this image of the media.
Can I ask a question about that, though? I accept what you're saying. I don't know if I'm a hero, but I accept there's some polarization. But is that different to the Muldoon era, where you had Rob's mob and everyone was either for or against Rob? Is this polarized? I mean, it seems to me he used to actually kick journalists out of his press conferences instead of just not answering the questions. Is this really new, or is there something different from that era?
That's probably a fair point, and but I still think that people could see another point of view. And if Muldoon was shown up, apart from the most fervent supporters, people could go, okay, well, that possibly is a point. Maybe he's not right there. I still like the guy, but okay, fair point. I don't think that exists now. Any sort of attack on you or Ardern or whatever, the supporter bases just won't countenance it. You're never wrong, either of you, with your fans. And it's led to this division in society that we now face. And frankly, I don't like it.
So just thinking about, I mean, I know that I think we're in a relatively good place in New Zealand, where I look at, in the US, you turn on Fox, you turn on CNN, you watch them side by side, and it's like they're reporting on different countries. But it may be that while we're not like that, you could agree that maybe we're in the wrong direction of travel. But I'm just touching on Newsroom. I mean, I'm just wondering about funding, innovation, and democracy, because it seems from what you're saying that, and you said there's been a lot of a squeeze on journalists and the number of reporters and perhaps even their salaries. And I know from experience, I've been a member of Parliament for 7 years. And a lot of journos I've known and a lot of backroom people that I've worked with have lost their job at some point in that period because there's these constant cuts. What you've done by going entirely online, I'm guessing your overheads are a lot lower than, say, having a TV station or even a radio station or having to print a newspaper and get it to thousands of houses every day. So you've innovated. But then there's still this question about, is there enough funding for democracy to work? And I just wonder, is there a role for government? I know a lot of people will want to ask about the Public Interest Journalism Fund. And I guess there's two questions there. I mean, one is people might criticize the existence of any sort of state funding of media, bearing in mind we have RNZ and in a way TVNZ. But then there's also some of the conditions that people see attached to that PIJF. I mean, can you comment a bit about, is it possible for innovation, such as Newsroom's done, to make it possible to get, the kind of, I guess, information and scrutiny that a democracy requires? And is it also necessary to have some other kind of funding? Because it seems like ad revenue, the rivers of gold you talked about in the 80s are sort of not really, maybe rivers of silver if you're lucky, streams of silver.
Yeah, I don't think this is even as good as that. No, look, your point is a very good one. Now, our instinctive position on this is we don't want government funding. Here's the thing that governments could do, though, and this is what the Australians have done. They need to make the social media giant platforms pay their share. They need to make them pay for the content that they use. When that happens, most of the problems, particularly for outfits like us, because you're right, we don't have a whole lot of legacy infrastructure that's just eating money. We are lean, and most of our cost is labour cost of journalists. But the thing is that if the government wants the media to be independent, thrive and stand on its own 2 feet, it has to deal with this problem. Now, the Australians have dealt with it. 250 million a year now goes from those social media giants into the media. And when you talk to journalists over there, their view now is that the newsrooms are going to be fine. They're in a completely different position. We are now, it's fair to say we may not have the same bargaining power as the Australians, but I have not seen enough willingness from the government to tackle this issue. Yes, they are putting some money, as you mentioned, the PIJF. It's 55 million over 2 years, spread out amongst all the media. It's peanuts, really, and so far, nearly all of it has gone into training of journalists, because even if we're able to ramp up in New Zealand, there isn't the trained journalists to do those jobs.
Can I just ask a question just for the context? You say 55 million. I mean, you might not know offhand, but just a ballpark. I mean, what would be the total revenue of the New Zealand media that people think of? Stuff and NZME and TVNZ and Newsroom and the spin-off and so on. I mean, if you add them all together, what sort of revenue?
Well, TVNZ's about 350 million. So I suppose about over $1 billion.
Okay. So 55 million over 2 years might be about 2% of.
Yeah, it's very small, and most of that money has gone into paying for training schemes for journalists. Because if we ever do get more money into the media, there won't be the journalists there to do it. The PR industry has gutted the industry of what I call the middle-ranking journalists, the ones who are the bedrock of journalism. A lot of them have gone, as you pointed out. The other has gone into trying to foster Maori journalism and Maori journalists, and then regional journalism. So nothing has really gone into mainstream reporters so far, certainly nothing going into politics or any other area of reporting.
Yeah.
And these are areas that the media simply is not going to do, is not going to really support unless it does get some help or it does become more economically viable.
Yeah. So if you're Michael Moore, who personally I think is the best reporter in New Zealand because he works hard and he gets into his stories and he breaks stories that I don't think the rest of the world would like to be out there, particularly the government. So I really like him. This PIJF doesn't really get near him, is what you're saying.
No, it won't really help produce more reporters like that. Certainly not in the short term. It may longer term down the track, but the other question is, we all go out and we're likely to get some funding for a Maori affairs reporter. After 2 years, what's going to happen? If the government has not moved to even up the playing field between the local media organisations, and the power imbalance here is just unbelievable. 95 or certainly somewhere between 90-95% of every dollar spent on digital advertising goes to either Facebook or Google or YouTube. 95%. We're surviving off 5%. It's just crazy.
Yeah, it's extraordinary that we still have any media when you put it that way. I mean, any other business, if a foreign competitor came in and took 95 cents of your revenue, it'd be pretty difficult to continue. Hey, look, we're going to have to. Sorry to move you on, but we've got to go to our audience questions. So Anthony says, could you please comment on whether having a free, open, competent, believable, non-partisan, and geez, you're layering it on thick, Anthony, and transparent media would stop the need for people to seek risky truths from other sources like Twitter. That's right, you should not go on Twitter. It's a very bad place. And Facebook, which is not so bad because that's how we're broadcasting this. So I guess it's a question about, if there's not a media that people trust, then, they're potentially going to get what Anthony's calling risky truths.
Yeah, well, are they? I don't think so. I mean, first of all, the latest Horizon poll shows 48% of New Zealanders do trust the media. I find it interesting whenever I ask somebody, well, do you not trust the media? And they go, oh no, well, we trust you. It's just that it's stuff we don't trust. Or if I ask the next person, they say, oh no, we trust you, but it's RNZ we don't trust, or it's the Herald we don't trust. I mean, to me, this is kind of exaggerated bollocks.
Is it a bit like lawyers? I mean, no one trusts lawyers, but everyone trusts their lawyer. Oh yeah, no, she's great. I really trust her with my life.
Yeah, exactly. And here's another thing to turn this on its head. Our readership and viewership and listenerships are at record levels. Record levels. Now, if the media is so distrusted, why is this the case?
And is that just because there's a crisis on and everyone sort of wants to know what's happening, or is that part of a longer term trend?
Well, that I think that proves the point, isn't it? Yes, we are in a crisis, and where are people turning?
No, good answer.
We can't be turning to this untrusted media, surely.
Yeah, well, we wouldn't normally trust you if there's a crisis. So Steve says some background detail on the $55 million would be good to hear. What are the recipients and what sort of projects are funded? So I think Mark's given a really good answer to that earlier, Steve. If you didn't see it, you can always scroll back.
There's one question though, David, that I quite like to address on that, because people come up with this thing that if you take that money, somehow the government or the Prime Minister or Grant Robinson is pulling a string on you. I mean, again, that is the biggest load of bollocks ever. That money comes with no strings attached, and we make sure that it doesn't enter our thinking, at all. If you think somehow that we would go softer on Labor, or some of our journalists would pull their punches on that, that's just stupid. And you
Yeah,
have
and
to
I want to back
become.
up on that. I mean, as I said at the beginning, I've known Mark for must be 5 or 6 years. He's done stories on me and actor, and we've talked about various things over the years. And look, I believe that. I don't believe that someone like Mark would say, "Oh well, they gave me money, so I'm not going to ask a question." It's not why. It's not in his DNA. But I want to go back to Jackie. So really, in a way, you've just answered Jackie's question. If a journo gives an opinion against this government, will he be removed? Like Magic Talk Radio, which has lost very popular journos, not afraid to question Labor ministers. Are we under a dictatorship, in Mark's opinion? So, Mark, maybe just the second part about what's happening at Magic, if you're able to talk about that.
Yeah, sure. Look, I think what's happening at Magic is entirely based on commercial reality. That station has dug itself a pretty big hole. It couldn't. Cam Wallace, who's the CEO, I don't think could risk another host making a poor judgment call or a racist remark or something that had an advertiser boycott based on it. Because in the last fiasco around banks and others, Magic was able to confine the losses to Magic. But MediaWorks owns a whole lot of very successful radio stations. And if advertisers decided, all right, you're in the same stable, we're going to take money off More FM, we're going to take money off The Breeze to punish you for this, then he would be in serious trouble. So I think it's really just pragmatic basis while he works out what the strategy for that station will be. And you'll see it come back with, probably a new format, a new name, and a livelier lineup.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. For me, the real question is why somebody like Vodafone acted the way that they did. And my understanding, and you don't have to comment or confirm on this, but my understanding is that some people, and it may not have been Vodafone, maybe it was other advertisers, but certainly the advertisers did behave very aggressively. And you sort of have to wonder, if you're running a phone company, why you're prepared to be so aggressive as to risk your advertising relationship over what is a political issue. But be that as it may, that's perhaps we'll see if we can't get Russell Stanners on to talk about the past of Vodafone or even the current guy.
I think, look, there were a number of advertisers, including KiwiBank as well, that pulled money immediately from that. But why they do that is that they don't. Well, there's two reasons. First of all, their own ethical position is that they won't tolerate racism of any shape or form, and I think that's fine. I mean, it is fine. It should be the case. The second reason, if you want to look a bit more widely at their business, is that none of these companies want to suffer a social media pile-on. And these things now spread like bushfires when these things happen. And suddenly they blow out of control. So when you say acting quickly and aggressively, what they do is they actually stop that before it gets started. And if you don't act within probably the first 30 minutes, then potentially it's like Delta, it's away.
Yeah. See, I, on the other hand, think a social media pile-on's good for the soul and sometimes good for the poll as well, but that's just me. I'm not running a telco. So I just wonder, finally, just going back to something you said earlier, we've got a question from Dave. Is the government deliberately not going after the Facebooks of the world, unlike the Australian government, so they can control the narrative in New Zealand? I suspect the reason behind that is more to do with bargaining power, or is it political will? I mean, I guess if Australia calls up Mark Zuckerberg, he thinks, well, that's 25 million people. If New Zealand calls up Mark Zuckerberg, he has to look on the map, I suspect.
Yeah, I think that's a bit of that. But we are still a really valuable market for them. We're a very easy market, and they still take a lot of money out of here. So it's not like we have zero bargaining power, but we haven't even fired a shot yet. I think a little bit of it is to do with Chris Farfoy's nature. I don't think he is a confrontationist, head-stomping politician. I think he'd rather try and talk and negotiate with it. And, maybe if we had some sort of head kicker in that role, it might be different. The Australians like I was saying right back at the start, they're head kickers. They're not scared of this stuff. Whereas, you know, we like to get along with everybody. We're New Zealanders. And if we can do a deal, you know, without a whole lot of aggravation, then that's good. And that's what I think's happening.
Put Phil Twyford in charge. You have it sorted in no time. Hey, you're not allowed to laugh at that, but look, I just want to thank you very much, Mark. We've come to time. I'm really glad we did this. I think that it's really critical for democracy that you know, we have a good understanding of institutions, and having had so many questions about journalism over the last year, I couldn't think of a better person to come and tell a story of 40 years in the trade. Mark's been also a business person, actually running an outfit in a couple of instances, so he's got some understanding of some of the commercial pressures, and he's absolutely committed to his craft, and I believe that. So it's been a really helpful conversation. I hope our listeners have enjoyed it. Really good of you to give up your time, and I've kind of enjoyed the role reversal, so who knows, you know, where the future might take us. But thank you again, Mark, and thank you very much, everybody, for watching ACT TV tonight.
It's brilliant.